By mid-1944, the air war over the Pacific had settled into a dangerous rhythm. High above the open ocean, where there were no landmarks and no witnesses, single aircraft often moved ahead of friendly formations, scouting, repositioning, or simply late to rejoin the group. On this day, one American P-47 Thunderbolt cruised alone, its massive radial engine holding a steady note against the thin air. Friendly cover lagged behind, distant enough to be irrelevant if trouble appeared quickly. Trouble rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived as light first, sun glare flashing off metal where metal should not have been. At the edge of vision, shapes resolved into intent. Japanese fighters were climbing and closing, their approach disciplined and deliberate. There was no frantic movement, no uncertainty. They had seen the thunderbolt. They had counted it. And they were confident in what came next. The count settled at 5. Not scattered, not rushed, but arranged with purpose. Tight spacing, clean lines, practiced aggression. This was not a chance encounter, it was an interception. Against a lone American fighter, the numbers felt less like arithmetic and more like pressure. Each aircraft represented another angle, another gun, another narrowing margin of error. The pilot reached for the radio. Static answered back. No voices. No immediate help. The Pacific below offered nothing but distance, and the sky around him was already shrinking. Altitude that once meant safety now became a rapidly closing ledger of time. Every second erased options. The P-47 was not a small aircraft. It was heavy, broad-shouldered, and impossible to disguise. Designed to endure punishment, it carried that strength openly, almost conspicuously. In formation, its size was reassurance. Alone, it was exposure. Against 5 enemy fighters built for agility and coordination, the imbalance was unmistakable. Distance vanished first. Then altitude. What remained was inevitability pressing inward. This was not yet a fight, only the moment before one began, when belief still outpaced evidence. 5 attackers closed on a single thunderbolt, certain they understood what they were about to destroy. What none of them could yet see was that the imbalance they trusted was about to be tested, not by speed or numbers, but by assumptions that had not survived the sky for very long. The Japanese fighters did not rush. They divided. 2 peeled slightly high, 3 dropped lower, their spacing measured and intentional. It was a formation shaped by experience, refined through repetition. Each aircraft took a role without hesitation, creating overlapping angles of attack that compressed the sky around the thunderbolt. This was not improvisation. It was doctrine in motion, control achieved through geometry. From a distance, the maneuver looked calm. Up close, it felt suffocating. Numerical advantage does not announce itself with noise, it presses inward, silently narrowing possibility. 5 aircraft meant 5 guns, 5 vectors, 5 opportunities for a single mistake to become final. The imbalance was no longer theoretical. It had weight. Inside the cockpit, the American pilot did not react with panic. He calculated. Fuel first, how long the engine could stay at power. Altitude next, how much vertical space remained to trade for speed. Then position, where each attacker sat in relation to the sun, the horizon, and one another. These were not heroic thoughts. They were practical ones. Survival, at this stage, was a matter of accounting. The P-47's size, once reassuring on the ground and in formation, now felt exposed. Its broad wings and thick fuselage caught the eye easily. There was no mistaking it for something nimble or elusive. Against smaller fighters built to turn tightly and swarm, the Thunderbolt looked like a single large answer to 5 sharp questions. Later, observers would study this moment and ask how such an engagement was allowed to begin. Why a lone aircraft flew ahead? Why distance opened? Why 5 enemy fighters were permitted to close unchallenged? These questions would be reasonable, but they belonged to hindsight, not the sky. In the air, the moment still allowed a narrow margin of negotiation. If timing aligned, if the attackers hesitated, if the geometry fractured, survival remained conceivable. But as the formations tightened and angles sharpened, that margin shrank rapidly. What began as pressure hardened into belief on one side that numbers would decide the outcome, and on the other that only something unconventional could interrupt it. And as the distance closed further, doubt replaced calculation, forcing the Thunderbolt's pilot to confront a single question: what could possibly shift a fight already counted? The P-47 Thunderbolt had never been loved for elegance. From its earliest days, it carried a reputation that clung stubbornly to its broad frame, oversized, blunt, excessive. Pilots joked that it looked more like a flying engine than an aircraft, its thick fuselage wrapped around a massive radial heart. Compared to the slimmer fighters that dominated pre-war imagination, the Thunderbolt appeared almost defiant in its refusal to be graceful. That shape was not an accident. The aircraft had been designed outward from strength, horsepower first, then armor, then the ability to fall through the sky faster than anything meant to follow it. 8.50 caliber machine guns lined its wings. Steel protected the pilot. The engine itself was a shield of rotating mass. Speed, when earned through altitude, was not borrowed, it was overwhelming. The Thunderbolt was built to survive mistakes and to punish those who chased it carelessly. Critics saw only what it lacked. In close-turning combat, the P-47 could not dance. Its roll rate was workmanlike, its turning circle wide. Against fighters bred for finesse, it seemed unsuited for the intimate geometry of a dogfight. On paper, it was a compromise. In rumor, it was a liability. Japanese pilots carried these assumptions with them into the sky. Against a heavy American fighter, attrition felt inevitable. Their aircraft had proven deadly in tight engagements, and early victories reinforced the belief that agility always defeated mass. A single Thunderbolt, separated from cover, appeared less like a challenge than a process. Inside the cockpit, belief took a different shape. The American pilot did not see bulk, he felt familiarity. He knew how much punishment the airframe could absorb, how the engine responded under strain, how the aircraft behaved when pushed vertically rather than laterally. He understood its strength not as theory, but as memory. Agility, he knew, was only one currency in the air. Strength was another. And strength, applied correctly, could rewrite expectation. As both sides closed in, their beliefs hardened, one trusting numbers and maneuver, the other trusting mass and momentum. Between them hung a simple question: which understanding of air combat would survive contact with reality? Japanese fighter doctrine had been shaped long before this moment, refined in earlier wars and validated in the opening years of the Pacific conflict. It favored maneuverability above all else, tight turning circles, coordinated attacks, and pilots trained to read one another's movements instinctively. In this philosophy, control of the fight came not from raw power, but from position. The aircraft that could turn inside its opponent could decide when to strike, when to disengage, and when to press the kill. Early victories had confirmed this belief. Against heavier, less agile opponents, Japanese fighters had imposed their will through coordination and patience. They drew enemies into turning contests where mass became a disadvantage and speed bled away with every correction. These encounters did not feel chaotic. They felt inevitable. Experience reinforced doctrine, and doctrine hardened into confidence. From that perspective, the American P-47 fit neatly into an existing category. It was large. It was heavy. It carried speed only in a straight line and seemed reluctant to change direction quickly. To pilots trained to think laterally, to measure combat in arcs and angles, the Thunderbolt appeared predictable. Its strengths were visible. Its weaknesses assumed. 5 fighters against 1 promised more than numerical advantage. It promised control through pressure. By splitting high and low, by forcing constant adjustment, they could compress the Thunderbolt's options until it had none left. Each maneuver would demand energy. Each correction would cost speed. The airspace around the American aircraft would become smaller, tighter, more dangerous with every second. Numbers, in this context, were treated not as risk but as certainty. 5 aircraft meant 5 overlapping solutions to the same problem. If one attack failed, another would follow immediately. There was no need for haste, only discipline. Time favored those who could turn and reposition effortlessly. From the Japanese perspective, the outcome already felt written. This was not arrogance expressed through recklessness, but through assumption. The belief that doctrine, proven repeatedly, required no revision here. The Thunderbolt's size invited pursuit. Its isolation invited closure. The fight was already being counted in reverse. Yet certainty has a quiet flaw. It discourages curiosity. It replaces observation with expectation. As the fighters tightened their patterns and prepared to force the American into the turning fight they preferred, caution thinned. The focus narrowed to execution, not evaluation. What they did not question was whether the Thunderbolt would accept the kind of battle they were offering, or whether it would redefine the terms entirely. As formation discipline held and confidence peaked, one possibility remained unexamined, that the assumptions guiding this approach might soon become liabilities, exposed not by chance, but by design. Among American pilots, faith in the P-47 Thunderbolt was earned slowly and then held firmly. It was not an aircraft that inspired affection at first sight. It inspired confidence after return. Crews came back with holes in the wings, oil streaked along the fuselage, cylinders damaged but turning. Stories spread not of elegance, but of endurance. The Thunderbolt had a reputation for bringing pilots home when lighter aircraft would not. That confidence rested on tangible qualities. The radial engine, thick and exposed, was paradoxically resilient, capable of absorbing punishment without immediate failure. Armor plating protected vital systems and the pilot himself. 8 heavy machine guns offered overwhelming firepower in brief, controlled bursts. In the calculus of survival, these elements mattered. They turned vulnerability into margin. American doctrine reflected this understanding. The P-47 was not meant to win by turning tightly or chasing opponents through horizontal spirals. It was designed for energy fighting, using altitude to build speed, using speed to strike, and then converting momentum back into distance and safety. The aircraft excelled when it could choose when to engage and when to disengage. Control came from vertical space, not lateral agility. Even so, doctrine carried its own warnings. Lone engagements were discouraged. The Thunderbolt was durable, but it was not invincible. Numbers still mattered. Coordination still mattered. Training emphasized formation strength and mutual support for a reason. Against multiple opponents, survival depended on discipline and restraint as much as courage. Inside the cockpit, theory met reality. The pilot understood the risks clearly. He knew what the aircraft could do, and just as importantly, what it could not. Turning to meet 5 attackers on their terms would be fatal. Climbing blindly would invite pursuit. Every option carried consequence, and there was no checklist for isolation. What remained was execution. The ability to apply doctrine without the comfort of formation. To trust the aircraft without surrendering judgment. To use strength without mistaking it for invulnerability. As the distance closed and belief hardened on both sides, the Thunderbolt's reputation was no longer an abstract idea. It was about to be measured, second by second, decision by decision, against an enemy convinced that faith alone could not outweigh numbers. The Japanese fighters committed almost simultaneously. From their split positions, they began attack runs designed to force reaction rather than provoke escape. Tracers stitched briefly through the air, not yet precise, but close enough to demand attention. The geometry tightened. This was the moment when theory gave way to contact, when belief encountered resistance. The P-47 absorbed the first exchanges with grim indifference. Rounds struck metal and fabric, some glancing, some biting. The aircraft shuddered but held its line. The radial engine continued to pull, its deep vibration unchanged. What would have crippled a lighter fighter became noise and impact, alarming but incomplete. Survival, for the moment, remained intact. As the distance closed, the pilot's priorities shifted. Speed alone no longer mattered. Altitude did. Every foot of vertical space represented potential energy, a stored possibility waiting to be converted. The horizon became less important than the sky above and below. This was not a chase to be outrun, but a fight to be shaped. Turning was dismissed immediately. To enter a horizontal contest would be to accept the terms the attackers wanted. The Thunderbolt's mass would bleed energy too quickly. The pilot resisted instinct, refusing to react to each pass with defensive maneuver. Reaction would be predictable. Predictability would be fatal. Instead, he sensed timing. Not speed, not reflex, but sequence. When to hold steady. When to allow attackers to commit fully before responding. The difference between survival and destruction lay not in how fast the aircraft moved, but in when it moved. Conventional defense offered no solution here. Evasion without purpose would only delay the inevitable. The P-47 could not dodge indefinitely. It had to redefine the engagement, not endure it. That realization arrived quietly, without panic, but with urgency. As gunfire continued and formation pressure increased, the fight ceased to resemble anything taught in basic diagrams. It demanded reinterpretation of space, of motion, of advantage itself. And as the pilot prepared to act on that understanding, one truth became unavoidable: the Thunderbolt would not survive by avoiding the enemy. It would survive by forcing them to follow. In the brief space between attack runs, the pilot made a decisive shift, not in maneuver, but in understanding. He stopped thinking of the P-47's mass as a limitation and began treating it as stored force. Weight, when paired with altitude, was not a burden. It was momentum waiting to be released. In that realization, the character of the fight began to change. He eased the nose down and allowed gravity to participate. The Thunderbolt entered a controlled dive, its massive airframe accelerating rapidly as altitude converted cleanly into speed. This was not desperation. It was intention. The aircraft did not dart or twist, it fell with purpose, gathering velocity that lighter fighters could not easily match without consequence. Dive speed became the primary asset. The P-47 was built to tolerate it, its structure reinforced, its control surfaces stable even as air rushed violently across them. In contrast, the Japanese fighters faced limits. To follow too steeply risked compression and loss of control. To hesitate meant surrendering position. The choice was no longer simple. Vertical space replaced horizontal maneuvering as the battlefield. The sky was no longer a flat plane of turns and arcs, but a column upward and downward movement defining advantage. The Thunderbolt climbed just enough to reset, then dropped again, each cycle deliberate and measured. The fight was being pulled out of the geometry the Japanese pilots preferred and into one they had not planned for. As they attempted to follow, cracks appeared. Some dives were shallower. Some pullouts were early. Formation spacing widened under strain. Coordination, once effortless, required adjustment. The Thunderbolt did not need to outturn its opponents. It only needed to make them choose between staying together and staying safe. With each vertical pass, an energy advantage emerged. Speed accumulated where it had once been traded away. The P-47 began arriving at firing positions with authority rather than urgency. Time, previously compressed, now expanded just enough to allow judgment. Gradually, control shifted. The Thunderbolt began dictating tempo when contact occurred, how long it lasted, and where separation followed. The Japanese fighters were no longer shaping the engagement. They were responding to it. The fight had changed shape. What began as encirclement became pursuit. What began as pressure became hesitation. And in that altered geometry, where mass and momentum ruled, the assumptions that had guided the opening moments no longer applied. The next phase would prove whether this new balance could be turned into something final, or whether control, once gained, could still be lost. The pilot did not linger after each pass. He climbed just enough to reclaim altitude, then rolled the Thunderbolt back into another controlled dive. These were not isolated maneuvers, but a sequence, each attack linked to the next, each movement calculated to preserve energy rather than spend it. The fight unfolded in measured cycles, not frantic exchanges. Fire discipline became essential. The P-47's gun spoke only when alignment was certain. Short bursts, precise and restrained, cut through the air. Ammunition was not wasted on possibility. Every trigger pull carried intent. This restraint did more than conserve resources, it imposed rhythm. The Thunderbolt struck, disengaged, and returned on its own terms. Below and around him, the Japanese formation began to fray. What had once been tight and confident now required constant correction. Aircraft slipped out of alignment during pullouts. Vertical spacing increased as pilots compensated individually for speed and stress. Coordination, once assumed, had to be rebuilt in real time. With each pass, separation grew. Angles widened. Mutual support weakened. The Thunderbolt's presence imposed delay, forcing decisions under pressure rather than rehearsed response. Japanese pilots found themselves reacting late, arriving just behind the moment where control could have been reclaimed. Confidence shifted almost imperceptibly at first. It showed in hesitation, slight pauses before committing to dives, longer breaks between attacks. The certainty that had framed the opening moments gave way to recalculation. The Thunderbolt was still there. It was still flying cleanly. It was still dictating the pattern. The P-47 remained intact through it all. Damage was cosmetic, not structural. Controls responded as expected. The engine continued to pull with steady insistence. The aircraft absorbed strain without complaint, validating the design philosophy that had once been mocked as excessive. Momentum built not through spectacle, but through accumulation. Each successful cycle reinforced the next. Speed begot position. Position begot opportunity. Opportunity, carefully used, threatened outcome. What had begun as survival had become leverage. The fight no longer asked whether the Thunderbolt could endure. It asked whether its opponents could adapt quickly enough to interrupt a pattern already taking hold. The answer would arrive soon, carried not by numbers, but by a single misjudgment, waiting just one pass ahead. The first mistake was small. Almost invisible. One Japanese fighter committed to a dive just a fraction too steep, chasing the Thunderbolt's falling mass with confidence shaped by habit rather than calculation. The aircraft accelerated quickly, but not cleanly. Control tightened. The pullout came late. In a fight defined by margins, that delay was enough. The P-47 answered without hesitation. As the Thunderbolt rolled and leveled, its guns aligned naturally, almost effortlessly. The pilot did not spray. He waited. When the sight settled, he fired a short, deliberate burst. 8 heavy machine guns spoke at once, their convergence compressing time into impact. The Japanese fighter disintegrated in motion. Not dramatically, but decisively. Metal ruptured. Control vanished. What had been an attacker seconds earlier became debris falling away into the Pacific below. There was no ambiguity in the result. The sky recorded the outcome instantly. Shock rippled through the remaining formation. It did not arrive as panic, but as interruption. The rhythm they had been responding to fractured. The certainty that had framed the engagement, 5 against 1, pressure applied until collapse, could no longer be assumed. One variable had changed irreversibly. Hesitation followed. Attacks that had been synchronized now required confirmation. Pilots checked spacing. They reassessed altitude. They questioned angles that moments earlier had felt automatic. The Thunderbolt did not slow or disengage. It climbed, reset, and prepared to fall again. Numerical certainty fractured with the loss. For fighters remained, but the count no longer felt stable. The arithmetic of advantage had been exposed as conditional, dependent not on presence, but on control. And control was no longer evenly distributed. The American pilot recognized the shift immediately. This was not the moment to retreat. It was the moment to compress doubt. He pressed the advantage, maintaining tempo, refusing to grant the remaining fighters the time needed to rebuild coordination. The engagement crossed an invisible threshold. What had been a contest of survival became a contest of outcome. The Thunderbolt was no longer reacting to danger, it was generating it. Each vertical pass carried the memory of the fallen aircraft, sharpening caution on one side and resolve on the other. From this point forward, the fight could not return to its opening terms. The balance had tipped, not through attrition, but through belief undone by evidence. What followed would determine whether that fracture widened or whether it could still be repaired before the sky claimed another answer. The loss forced reassessment in mid-air, where there was no pause and no margin for reflection. Japanese pilots recalculated instinctively distance, altitude, fuel, spacing, all while still maneuvering under threat. The sky that had felt controlled only moments earlier now demanded constant verification. Every assumption required proof. Every movement invited consequence. Coordination weakened under that pressure. Formation discipline, once automatic, gave way to individual correction. Pilots adjusted independently, compensating for widening gaps and uneven energy states. Attacks that had once flowed as a single intent now arrived staggered, their timing fractured. Mutual support existed in principle, but not in execution. Above them, the Thunderbolt climbed again. The P-47 repeated the vertical cycle with unbroken consistency. Climb. Roll. Dive. Fire. Separate. The pattern was neither aggressive nor cautious, it was methodical. The aircraft trusted altitude and gravity more than instinct, converting height into speed and speed into choice. Each cycle preserved energy while forcing the enemy to spend it. One Japanese fighter attempted to stay engaged, committing to a pursuit that could not be sustained. Damage from an earlier pass made control imprecise. The dive was shallow, the recovery slow. The Thunderbolt did not chase. It simply arrived. Another brief burst, another violent correction in the air. The damaged fighter broke away, trailing smoke, abandoning the engagement to preserve what remained. Aggression faded into reaction. The remaining fighters no longer pressed simultaneously. They waited. They watched. Their movements reflected caution rather than initiative, shaped by the fear of being isolated in vertical space they could not control. The Thunderbolt was no longer being hunted. It was being avoided. Control shifted fully in these moments, not through spectacle, but through inevitability. The P-47 dictated when contact occurred and when it ended. It chose the axis of movement and forced every opponent to respond along it. Altitude belonged to the Thunderbolt. Timing belonged to the Thunderbolt. The sky itself seemed to bend around that dominance. Japanese fighters maneuvered defensively, breaking away early, preserving distance rather than closing it. The engagement's original purpose dissolved. Survival replaced victory as the governing priority. For fighters now faced one, but the equation no longer mattered. The Thunderbolt dominated not because it destroyed everything in front of it, but because it removed choice. It imposed a reality that could not be ignored or reversed. The climax of the fight did not arrive as a single moment, but as a realization shared silently by all involved. This encounter would not end the way it was meant to. What remained was collapse, not of machines, but of belief, and the sky was about to grow quieter because of it. The remaining fighters no longer moved as a single body. Without command or signal, coordinated attack gave way to separation. What had once been an organized pressure became a scattering of individual decisions, each shaped by altitude, fuel, and the urgent need to survive. Formation, once a source of strength, now represented risk. Individual survival replaced group strategy. Each pilot began to fly his own fight, breaking away early, turning wide, conserving energy where possible. The discipline that had defined their approach at the start of the engagement dissolved under strain. Doctrine offered no comfort here. This was not a situation it had prepared them to escape. The P-47 continued dictating terms with calm authority. It did not chase recklessly or pursue aircraft already disengaging. Instead, it occupied space deliberately, positioning itself where it could deny advantage and impose caution. The Thunderbolt's presence alone shaped behavior, forcing opponents to maneuver defensively even when no shots were fired. Minutes stretched longer than expected. What had begun as a brief interception became an extended ordeal. Fuel burned steadily. Altitude was traded carefully, then reluctantly. Every climb demanded consideration. Every dive carried risk. The Thunderbolt's ability to reset vertically denied resolution, prolonging uncertainty for those trying to leave. Japanese confidence collapsed in stages. Certainty vanished first, followed by initiative. What remained was restraint driven by fear of isolation. The sky no longer felt like a place of opportunity, but of exposure. The Thunderbolt did not need to press its advantage aggressively, its continued control was enough. Escape replaced victory as the guiding objective. One by one, fighters disengaged when distance allowed, turning away without ceremony. There was no regrouping, no final exchange. The engagement ended not with a climax of destruction, but with absence. The fight was over because it could no longer continue. The Thunderbolt remained alone in the airspace it had claimed, its engine steady, its authority unquestioned. In the quiet that followed, the significance of what had just occurred began to take shape, an encounter decided not by numbers, but by understanding, and soon to be measured far beyond the Pacific sky. When the sky finally fell quiet, the change was unmistakable. The pressure that had compressed time and space dissolved, leaving only altitude, engine noise, and the wide Pacific below. Inside the cockpit, the pilot allowed himself a moment, not to celebrate, but to assess. Habit replaced adrenaline. He began with the instruments. Oil pressure steady. Temperatures within limits. The engine, though stressed, remained dependable. Fuel was lower than planned but sufficient. Each gauge told a story not of triumph, but of survival measured carefully and without exaggeration. Only then did he look outward. The P-47 bore the marks of contact. Punctures along the wings. Scoring across metal skin. Evidence of rounds that had struck and failed to finish their work. None of it impaired control. The aircraft had absorbed punishment exactly as it had been designed to do, its strength expressed not in absence of damage, but in the ability to continue despite it. The radio crackled back to life as the pilot reported in. The words were factual, restrained, and difficult to believe. 5 enemy fighters engaged. Losses inflicted. No immediate support. Silence followed the transmission, not from disbelief alone, but from the need to reconcile the account with expectation. Friendly pilots questioned the report, cautiously and professionally. Clarifications were requested. Timelines repeated. Positions confirmed. This was not skepticism born of doubt in the pilot, but of the improbability of the event itself. Air combat rarely unfolded so cleanly and rarely ended so unevenly. Enemy losses were confirmed gradually, piece by piece. Reports aligned. Absences were noted. What had occurred in isolation gained definition through corroboration. The encounter shifted from personal experience to shared record, from story to fact. The P-47 returned alone. No formation joined it. No escort closed in. The Thunderbolt crossed back into friendly airspace carrying more than damage and fuel calculations. It carried consequence. Its silhouette, unchanged, now suggested something more than endurance. Reputation does not form in the air. It forms afterward, in debriefings, in quiet retellings, in how events are remembered and repeated. This encounter, compressed into minutes, began to expand outward. Not as legend, but as example. The sky had fallen quiet, but the effects of what happened there were only beginning to travel. And as the Thunderbolt touched down, its role shifted subtly from participant to proof that under the right understanding, imbalance could be turned and belief could be rewritten. In the days that followed, the engagement was reduced to sequence. Analysts reconstructed the fight minute by minute, aligning radio logs, fuel states, and reported positions. Altitudes were plotted. Timings compared. What had felt fluid in the air became linear on paper, stripped of noise and narrow to cause and effect. The conclusion was difficult to ignore. 5 enemy fighters had been neutralized or driven off in a span measured not in hours, but in minutes. There had been no reinforcement, no intervention, no sudden shift in weather. The outcome rested on decisions made quickly, under pressure, by a single pilot applying an understanding of his aircraft that doctrine had only partially described. This forced a re-evaluation not of courage, but of capability. The P-47 had long been seen as a specialist, a durable escort, a ground attack platform, a machine that traded finesse for survivability. What this encounter suggested was broader. When used correctly, the heavy fighter could dominate airspace not through turning contests, but through control of energy and time. Energy fighting, long emphasized in theory, gained renewed clarity in practice. Altitude was not merely insurance. It was leverage. Speed was not just escape. It was authority. Analysts noted how vertical maneuvering compressed enemy options while preserving one's own. The lesson was not revolutionary, but it was confirmed with unusual clarity. Small decisions emerged as decisive. The refusal to turn. The patience to wait for alignment. The discipline to fire briefly. The choice to disengage and reset rather than chase. None of these actions were dramatic in isolation. Together, they reshaped the engagement. War, the analysis suggested, was less sensitive to bravado than to judgment applied consistently. The P-47's image began to shift accordingly. Not overnight, and not universally, but perceptibly. It was no longer discussed solely in terms of what it lacked. Its strengths were reframed as situational advantages rather than compensations. The aircraft had not changed. The understanding of it had. This was not a story of inevitability. Had timing varied slightly, had altitude been lower, had ammunition been spent carelessly, the outcome might have reversed. The margin was never wide. That truth mattered as much as the victory itself. War, the analysts concluded, was sensitive, acutely so, to how knowledge was applied under pressure. Machines mattered. Numbers mattered. But judgment, exercised in moments measured by seconds, mattered more. And in those counted minutes over the Pacific, a heavy fighter had demonstrated that reputation was not a function of design alone, but of how decisively belief could be translated into action. Reputation in war is rarely born in a single moment. It forms through repetition, through stories told cautiously at first, then with increasing certainty. One engagement becomes a reference point. Another confirms it. Gradually, what was once an exception begins to feel like a pattern. The sky remembers even when the ground does not. The Thunderbolt's reputation followed this path. It did not emerge from proclamations or propaganda, but from accounts that resisted easy dismissal. Pilots spoke of vertical control, of aircraft that refused to break apart under stress, of fights that unfolded differently than expected. The P-47 was no longer described only by its size, but by its effect. Respect replaced tolerance. Among Japanese pilots, expectations adjusted quietly. Encounters with the Thunderbolt were approached with greater caution, greater distance. Assumptions that had once guided engagement about speed, agility, and inevitability were revised. The aircraft was no longer treated as a predictable opponent, but as one that demanded patience and restraint. This shift mattered. In air combat, expectation often shapes outcome before the first shot is fired. Courage, too, was reframed by this understanding. It was no longer defined by how tightly one turned or how aggressively one pursued. It became associated with control, with a discipline to wait, to disengage, to resist the impulse to chase. Courage expressed itself not in motion alone, but in judgment exercised under pressure. Power, when married to restraint, proved decisive. The Thunderbolt's strength lay not just in its engine or its guns, but in how those qualities were applied. Excess without understanding would have been wasteful. Understanding without restraint would have been reckless. Together, they produced authority in the air. Machines, the war continued to demonstrate, were amplified by those who understood them fully. Design offered potential. Training offered method. But belief, earned through experience, determined how those elements were combined. The Thunderbolt did not impose dominance by force alone. It did so by aligning design, doctrine, and decision into a single, repeatable logic. Identity was forged quickly in wartime, sometimes in months, sometimes in days, occasionally in minutes. The encounter over the Pacific compressed that process into a brief span, but its effects stretched outward. The Thunderbolt emerged not as a compromise, but as a statement of what heavy fighters could do when used without apology. Reputation, once earned, alters behavior on both sides of a fight. It changes how pilots approach the sky, how decisions are made before contact, and how risks are weighed afterward. In that sense, reputation becomes a force of its own, shaping outcomes long after the original moment has passed. And for the Thunderbolt, that force was born not in design rooms or training manuals, but in a few decisive minutes where understanding overcame assumption and control proved more powerful than speed alone. With historical distance, the fight appears almost fragile. Removed from the noise of engines and the compression of seconds, it becomes clear how easily the outcome could have shifted. A lower starting altitude, a moment of impatience, a burst fired too early. Any one of these would have unraveled the sequence that followed. The margin was never generous. It existed only because it was protected. 5 attackers had entered the engagement with confidence grounded in experience and reinforced by numbers. They left it as absence. Not all destroyed, not all defeated in the same way, but removed from relevance. The sky they had sought to control no longer belonged to them. What remained was space, quiet, and a single aircraft still flying by choice rather than necessity. The P-47 Thunderbolt would be remembered for many things over the course of the war. Its size, its durability, its range, its firepower. But this encounter narrowed that memory. Here, it was not the largest aircraft in the sky that mattered, it was the one that imposed consequence. Effect replaced appearance. Outcome replaced expectation. War, when stripped of scale, often turns on brief decisions. Not strategies drafted months earlier, nor machines perfected in factories far away, but judgments made in compressed time by individuals who understand their tools intimately. In this fight, seconds determined shape, and shape determined survival. The Thunderbolt did not win because it was superior in every category. It won because it was used correctly. Reputation formed faster than doctrine could absorb it. Manuals would be updated. Training refined. Lessons articulated more clearly in hindsight. But the reputation moved ahead of all that, carried pilot to pilot, encounter to encounter. The Thunderbolt became an aircraft that demanded respect not through intimidation, but through memory. What lingered was not spectacle, but clarity. The clarity that numbers alone do not decide air combat. That agility is not the same as control. That mass, when paired with understanding, can dominate space rather than surrender it. These truths were not new, but they were reaffirmed in a way that could not be ignored. The aircraft itself did not change that day. Its metal was the same. Its engine the same. Its guns the same. What changed was how it was perceived by enemies who adjusted their approach and by allies who trusted its potential more fully. Identity, once questioned, became settled. History does not always mark such moments loudly. There were no headlines written at altitude, no witnesses beyond those involved. But the sky recorded it nonetheless. 5 attackers met a single aircraft and left behind something more durable than wreckage. They left behind a lesson. They underestimated the aircraft. In minutes, it earned its name.